Today you will create a game where you can click the animal to earn the currency, also merge different animals to get a new animal of the next level. Also you can buy new animals, and you have functions like save, load and reset. So this game uses two main mechanics. One is clickable, so we have clickable elements like our pets and buttons, and also we are using drag and drop system, so I can take one animal and then I can merge it with others using the drag and drop system. But I think that the drag and drop system is quite advanced, so this is the reason why the first version of this game uses only clickable elements. So in this game, we also can click the animals, then we can merge different animals using the merge button, and then we can buy elements, and also we have save, load and reset functionality. So we will do exactly this game during the first episodes. This game uses HTML, CSS and JavaScript files, so I will give you the HTML and CSS files and we will be focused only on JavaScript, so on the logic of this game. To follow along this project, you need to know the basics of JavaScript, like ifs, loops and functions. Also you need to know the basics of DOM, so how to get the elements from HTML and then how to change them using the JavaScript. If you think that this is too difficult for you, I have a simpler project with a cookie clicker game. And now let's create a game plan for this project. At first, we need to create our game board. Then we need to create our clickable animals. So we generate an animal of the first level on one of the cells, and then we can click it to earn the currency. And if we have enough money, we can buy a new pet. So then we need to work on merging. So we will add this merge button, and if you click it, you see that this button is active, and now we can merge this animal with another one. Now this animal has a new level, so this is the second level animal, and when we click it, it gives 2 poopy currency. So now we can buy more animals, but if you try to merge animals of different level, you will see a message that pet levels are different and nothing will happen. So then we need to implement the save, load and reset functionality, so I can click the save button to save our game state. In this case, we will see the message that game is saved. Then let's reload our page. And now you see that we have a game from the beginning, but we have our saving. So I can press the load and you will see the message that game is load. And now you see that our state is returned back. So also we have the reset button. If you click it, you also see a message that game is reset, and then you will see our empty board. But reset button also deletes all our savings. If I try to click load button, you will see a message that no savings yet and nothing will change. And finally, we need to implement the Autoclicker. So in our shop, we have the Autoclicker button and I can buy it. Then I see that our Autoclicker is enabled and I start to earn our currency. And this currency is earned based on the best level of our animals. So currently we have animals only of the first level, but if I merge them, you will see that currently the best level of our animals is the second one, and we start to earn 2 currency per second. Let's look to the HTML file that you will use. So at first, you can notice that the file name index.html has this green color. You will not have it. This is because my files are connected to the Git. So it means that I store them on the GitHub and you can download them on the link from the description. So at first, we have the metadata of our HTML file. Here you see our title, and then you see the link to our CSS file, and then you see the link to our script.js file, and then starts our body section. Body section contains all the elements that you will see on the page. So you can see that here we have 100 lines, but you don't even need to understand them. Let me connect to the browser and let's see how this file looks like in our browser. In the right bottom corner, I have the Go Live button. If you don't have it, you need to download the Live Server extension. On the left hand side, you can find the Extensions Explorer. Then you need to click it, and in the searching bar, you need to write Live Server. Then you will see the Live Server by Ritwik Day. Download it it and you will see this button in the right bottom corner. So I click this button and now I see my game in the browser. So this is how our pure HTML looks like. It doesn't have any styles except of the default ones. Also here you can see the zoom property, and if you click it, you can change the zoom of our game. Even though that this page doesn't look pretty, this HTML file is the same as we have in the final version of this game. And here we actually have all the data. Here we have our currency counter. Here we store the best animal level. Then you see that we have a shop. So you see the buy button, then enable the Autoclicker, and then save, load, and reset buttons. Then you see the small instruction on how to play this game, and then you see our board, which is empty. So now let's connect our CSS, and you will see that this page will be much more beautiful. This is our style.css file. I connected it to the HTML on this line. The name here needs to match with your name of the file. So I have style.css and the name of my file is style.css. Now you clearly can see both panels. So we have the first panel with our UI elements like our counters and buttons, and then you see the right panel with our board, which is empty. CSS adds styles, so we will use it only for styling. This is a long file that you can download from the description. And finally, let's create our script.js file. We connect it to our HTML on this line, and here the name of the attribute must be the same as the name of your file. So I have script.js, and here I create script.js file. This file we will write from scratch. As you see, we don't have our board, so let's create our board. For that, I will create the first variable board. Our board will be an array. If we want to have 4x4 board, we need to fill this array with 16 values. So currently this board is empty, but I want to create 16 new empty cells. And each empty cell I will store as a null. So eventually we want to see something like that. Inside of the array, we want to see nulls separated by comma. So for that we can write a simple for loop. So we start from the index of 0 and then we go until our I is less than 16. Eventually we'll go through 16 numbers, and for each number we can add a new null to our board. For each cycle, I can push a null to our board. And now if you want to see the result, let's log to the console our board. And now let's open our console in the browser. For that I need to right click, and then I need to find the inspect property. So here you will see different tabs, and I need to find the console. If you don't see the console choice, you can click this double arrow icon, and here you will find the console. And then I will expand this console. And now you see the result in the console. This is an array with the length of 16. If I expand it, you will see that we have 16 null elements with the indexes from 0 to 15. So if you understand it, you can remain with the same code, but now I will show you how to write it in one line. So I can create a board using the new array constructor, and then I will pass the length of this array, which is 16, and then I call the method .fill with the value of null. Now, if you look to the console, you see that it looks a little bit differently, but if you expand it, you will see that we also have 16 values of nulls. This array looks differently because actually this is a different array. When you create an array with curly braces, you create a dynamical array. So this array has the initial length of 0, and then when you add new elements, it dynamically expands the sizes. But this is a static array where you must pass any number which represents the length of this array. So we can't add a new element out of these boundaries. For our project, this is not too important which array we use, static or dynamic. I just think that this line is easier to read. Again, it will not influence your code in the future, so you can stay with the code that you understand. Then I add a comment game data to separate this block. So here we will have only game data. I also want to delete this console log. So now we have our board in JavaScript, but based on this board, we need to generate our board on the page. So on the page, you see only HTML. So based on our values in JavaScript, we need to generate new HTML elements. So to better understand how it works, let's go to index.html file and then scroll down until you see our grid. So let's expand this div. So, and now inside of this div, I can create a new div with a class of cell, and you will see how one cell appears on our page. So this div is empty, so I don't change the content of this div, but I need to add a new class. And now you see that one cell is appeared on our page. This cell has almost the height of our container, and this is because I use flex properties in CSS for aligning our cells. So I implied that you will use more cells, so let's add new ones. If I have 4 cells, they fill an entire container. Let's add the 5th one, and now you see that they start to stretch. So eventually, if we create 16 cells, they will be aligned beautifully on our page. Why we can't write them manually? At first, if you want to change the board size, so for example, you want a board 5 by 5, you will need to manually add new cells. But the real problem is because we need to track each cell. Each cell can be empty or it can contain an animal. In JavaScript, you have this variable board, and this is the source of truth. And then if something happens on the page, we can change it in JavaScript board, and then we will regenerate this board again in the HTML. So let's try to generate the same board in JavaScript. For that, let's delete our manually created divs from HTML. So I select all these divs and then I delete them. Now you see only the border of our container, so you don't see any cells. So then for generating these cells on our board, we need to access the container from HTML. Here we will have the section for HTML elements. So now let's access our board. For that, let's create a new constant board element. So I write board L, I use the abbreviation for element for saving the space. If you want, you can write the full name board element. And then we have a function document.getElementById. So now inside of this method, we need to pass the ID of the element that we want to access. Let's go to our HTML file. Now you see that the ID of our board is grid. Let's copy this name and then we will pass it into this function. Now we can access this grid from JavaScript, and now we can start generating new cells. For that, I make a new section rendering. So inside of this section, we will write functions that update our elements on the page. So let's write a first function render. Inside of this function, let's go through all the cells of our board. For that, I use the most common for loop with the condition where I is less than board.length. And now for each cycle, let's create a new div. So I create a variable cell div, and now we have a function document.createElement. So inside of this function, we need to pass the name of the element that we want to create. So we can pass div. Now we created our div element, but the default div doesn't know how it should look like. And for that, we need to attach the class cell. I returned back to our HTML file, and here I manually created a new div, but we don't see it on our page. And this is because div doesn't have any default properties. All styling properties of this div are stored in the class cell. If we add this class cell, you see that it appears on our page. And this is what now we need to do in our JavaScript. I delete this div again. And now inside of the JavaScript, let's add this class to the cell div. And for that I can write cell div.className, which is equal to cell. So now we have a div that has a specific style properties, but we doesn't attach it to our grid. So let's append it to our board. So I use the appendChild method to add this div inside of our board element. But we still don't see any changes, and this is because we haven't called our function anywhere. For that, I create a new section GameStart, and here I call our initial function. Now, if I save this file, you can see our grid on the page. And now let's spawn our animal on the grid. So this animal is not clickable, but when I refresh our page, we spawn this animal on a random cell on our grid. So let's think how to put our animal on the grid. From the first view, it seems that this object has only the emoji of the chick, but actually it also contains the data about the clicking reward, the current level of the animal, and maybe other properties like name, because you may want to show these details on the page. We have one data structure objects that can contain many properties inside of it. So let's create an example pet, which will be an object. So for example, our pet might look like this. So we have an object with the key emoji, and with with the value of this emoji and also other properties like name, which is equal to chick. So this is good, but we want to have multiple pets during our game. So in our final version, we can merge the same pets to get a new pet of the next level. And this pet will have other properties as well as other emoji and name. And for that, we can store pets inside of the array. Let's call our variable pets. Now I can expand it. And now inside of this array, we can add other animals. I added 10 animals and their levels from 1 to 10. The first one is chick, and if we merge 2 chicks, we get a bunny, and so on until we get the unicorn. This will be our source of truth, and this will be our constants. So capital letters represent constants. And then if you want to add some properties or change our emojis, you can change them inside of this const pets, and it will affect an entire game. So now let's return to our version, and as you see, we have an empty board. So let's create a function for spawning our animals. For that, I will add a new section core actions right after our HTML elements. So inside of this section, we will write all the functions that represent the main logic of our game. So let's create a function spawn new pet. So this function should spawn the first level of animal. So for that, we need to access the first object inside of the constant pets. I can access the first object with the index of 0, and this will create a new variable pet which is equal to this object. One thing that you need to remember about this variable is not a copy of the object from our pets. This variable is just a link to the same object. It means that if we do any changes on this object, it will also affect the objects inside of the constant pets. If you don't understand why it works in this way, this is just because objects are reference value data types, and I have a short video about it. But let's return back. So what we need to do with this variable pet, we want to put it on our board. So our board is an array of 16 values which currently are nulls. So we can access the board by index, and then we can put our object pet inside of this index. So this code will put our pet object into the first position on our board. Currently, if you save this file, nothing will happen, and this is because of two reasons. The first, you haven't called this function yet. The second, you don't have any representation of our object inside of our HTML. So to show our animal on our board, we need to create a new div with this animal. So to better understand how it works, let's go to our index.html, and here inside of the grid div, let's create a new pet. So at first we need to create our cell. For that, I create a new div, and then I add the class for this div, which is cell. So now if I save this file, you will see that we have one additional cell on this board. Actually, we generated the first cell, and then more 16 cells have been generated due to our JavaScript code. Then you need to understand that the picture of our chick is just an emoji. So it means that we can copy this emoji, and then if you create a new tab in your browser, you will see that you can paste this emoji here. So it works as a common text. So let's close this tab and return back to our HTML file, and here inside of the div cell, let's add our emoji chick. And now if I save this file, you see that a small emoji of our chick is displayed on our page. So this is fine if you want to show only chick. In the final version of this game, you see that we don't have only our emoji, but we also have the level of this pet, the name, and the value how much you earn per click. If you want to display multiple objects on one cell, and if you want to have the full control over them, it means that putting your emoji as the part of the cell will not be enough. You need to create a new div inside of the div cell. So let's remove our emoji, and then let's create a new div. So this div will have the class of pet, and now let's paste our emoji inside of this class. So this div creates a new animal on our page, and you see that the styles of this div is different from the styles of our cell. This is because this div has the class pet, and this class pet contains other styles inside of our style.css file. So this is what we need to generate with our JavaScript. In the first layer, we'll create our grid with cells, and on top of it, we'll create a new layer with our animals. I will delete this code later, but now let's go to our JavaScript file. So our purpose is to create the same div on our page. We have the function render that is responsible for showing all the objects on our board. So inside of this function, let's create a new variable cell data. So this variable can be equal to null because initially our board is filled with nulls, or it can be equal to our pet object. Then we have the code that generates cells, so let's separate them. For that, I add a new comment that this block is responsible for cells, and then let's create a new block that is responsible for pets. Our cell data can be equal to null or our object. Here I check that our cell data is not equal to null, so it means that our cell data is equal to our object. And now, if this is a pet object, let's create a new div that will represent the pet. At first, let's return back inside of our HTML file, and here you see everything what we need to generate. So we need to create a new div with the class pet and with the content type of our chick emoji. So at first, I create a new div. Then let's attach the class pet to this div. And now let's change the content type to chick emoji. We can manually pass the emoji of our chick, but actually we have many other pets with other emojis. So it means that we need to get the emoji from the constant pets. I know that our object has the key emoji, and here I know that our cell data is equal to this object. So let's create a new variable emoji that gets the emoji from this variable. If I know that we definitely have this key, I can access it by writing celldata.emoji. There is also another way how I can access this emoji. I can put square brackets and then I can pass the name of our key. Typically we don't pass the hard-coded strings, we pass the variables. But if I know the exact name of our key, it is easier to access it by putting dot and then the name of the key. And now we can pass this variable into our text content. At this point, we have created the same div with our JavaScript, but we also need to put it inside of the cell div. So for that, let's look to our cells code. The first line is the same. We create a new div. So then we attached the class of cell, and then we appended our cell div to our board. But the problem is that we append this div too early. The cell div at this point doesn't contain the data about our animal. And this is the reason why I need to call this line after we generate our pet divs. And now before we append our cell to the board, let's append our pet to the cell. If I save this file, you will see that nothing happens, and this is because we need to call our function spawnPet. So in the end of our file, we have the section gameStart, and now before the render, let's call our spawnNewPet function. And now you see that we have two chicks. So one is from the HTML file. I can go here and delete this manually written chick. And currently you see that we have only one chick. Currently we have another problem that the position of this chick is fixed to be on the first cell. No matter how much I refresh this page, it is always on the same cell. But we want to generate this chick randomly on any cell from the first to the last one. Inside of our spawnNewPet function, we have this line that appends our pet on the first cell on the board. Instead of passing 0, we need to pass the index. But at this point, we don't have the variable index, so let's create a new variable. If this variable is equal to 0, it works absolutely the same, but actually we want to generate this index in the range from 0 to 15, because we have 16 cells and the ID of the last cell is 15. Or to be even more correct, the last index is not 50, this is the board.length. So it means that if I change our board size, here where I create our board, I can pass another value, for example 20. And now you see that we have 20 cells on our page, so it means that the last value of this index should be 19. So let's undo these changes. Now let's create a new function that will generate a random index. For that, I will create a new section helpers. This section will contain functions that we are using inside of our core action functions. So let's create a new function, generate pet index. And here we need to create a new variable index that will have a random number. I have a function math.random that generates a random number between 0 to 1, and then I wrap it inside of the math.floor. This function rounds the number to the nearest integer downside. I don't want to have values like 0 point something, I want to have integers like 0, 1, 2 and so on. And now here I can multiply the math random by our board size. And now we can easily calculate what this function will return if we replace the math random with 0 and then with 1. If we replace it with 0, the board length is 16 and 0 multiplied by 16 is 0. So the lowest number that this function will generate will be 0. And now let's replace it with 1, but actually math.random can't generate the 1, it generates the closest number to it. This is actually something like 0.999. And now if we multiply it by our board length, which is 16, we will get the 15.999. And then if we round it down, we will get the 15. And this is actually the range that we want. So it means that our formula works correctly, and now we can return this index. So now we know that this function generates the expected boundaries, and now we can call it inside of our spawn new pet. And if you save this file, you will see a chick on a random cell. So I can refresh this page several times, and you will see that our chick is generated on a random cell. And now let's make our animals clickable. So every time when I click it, you see that my poop counter increases by 1. Also, if I have enough currency, I can buy a new animal. In our current code, we don't have any access for our UI elements, so we don't update them. Currently, our poop counter and the best level counter are 0. And no matter what we do, they are always 0. So at first, let's access these elements and let's make a function for updating our poop currency. So in the game data section, I create a new element poop. This time I'm using a let keyword because poop is a counter and we will change it in the future. Let's also create a variable for the best level. So then we have the HTML element section. So now inside of this section, let's access the corresponding HTML elements. Now I need to find this element in our HTML file. And now I see that inside of the B tag, we have the ID poop that contains the value of 0. This is exactly what we need to change when we update our poop currency. So let's copy this ID and let's paste it inside of this function. Now let's do the same for the best level. You can write the full name of this variable like best level element. I have very few space on my screen, so I need to have short and concise variables. Inside of our HTML element, I see the B tag with the ID of best level. So this is the variable that we need to change in our JavaScript. I paste the ID best level to this function, and now we can write a new function that will update our UI elements. Inside of the rendering section, we have the render function that updates our board, but we also need to update our counters right after the render function. Let's create a new function update UI. So at first, let's change the text content of our poop currency. So we assign it to our global variable poop that stores how much currency we have in our JavaScript. And then let's do the same for the best level. So now let's check how this function works. And for that, let's change our global counters. So here I changed the poop value to 10 and the best level to 1. And now in the game start, right after our render, we need to call our update UI function. And now you see that our counters have been updated. Then let's create a function that will increase our poop by the level of our animal. I have the section helpers. So inside of this section, I can create a new function increase poop. So this function needs to increase the global variable poop by a certain amount. So at first, let's increase it by 1. For that, I can write poop++. So this function will not return anything. And then we need to call this function when we click our animal. So in the rendering section, we access each cell from our board. If cell is not equal to null, it means that we have our pet. And now we want to attach a new trigger to this pet. So before we append our pet div to the cell div, let's add our trigger. For that, I have a method addEventListener that I can call for the pet div. This listener expects two values. The first value is the trigger itself. So when we need to call a specific function, I can right click, so it means that when I click this div, I need to call a specific function. Then I put comma, and now as the second parameter, I can pass a function that I want to execute. So we want to execute increasePoop function. This is very important to pass this function without parentheses. In this case, the addEventListener will be able to execute this function. Currently, if I click our chick, nothing happens, and this is because inside of the increasePoop function, we doesn't call updateUI function. So here we need to call our updateUI function because poop is just a counter inside of the JavaScript and our user doesn't see it. We need to update our HTML elements to see any change on this page. So I call this function, and now if you try to click our chick, you will see that the counter increases by 1. Let's return back to our trigger. So here, if I add parentheses right after increasePoop, you will see that our counter is increased by 1, but then our trigger doesn't work. Because parentheses means execution of this function. So it is executed once and then we can't execute it again. This is the reason why I need to remove this parenthesis and why I need to pass this function as a parameter. In this case, our event listener can call it. So now it seems that this function works, but as I said, we doesn't need to increase our counter by 1, we need to increase it by the level of our animal. We have an array pets that contains all the data about all the possible animals. Currently, all these objects don't have the level and the reward that you get if you click this animal. So let's add these attributes. So now I extended our array. Each animal inside of this array has its own level and the reward. So now you can see that the last animal, unicorn, has the level of 10 and the reward of 55. And now we need to do in this way that our function increasePoop takes the reward of a specific animal that we click, and then it increases our poop counter by this reward. At first, let's go to our increasePoop function. So here we need to pass a new parameter, which is reward. And now I can increase poop by this reward. For that, I write poop plus equal reward. So now let's click our animal. You will see that our counter have been changed to something strange. And this is because we don't pass the expected reward. But we don't have this variable yet, so let's create it. So before I create a new div, let's create a new variable reward. So currently I know that our object contains this data. Inside of our array pets, we have a new parameter reward with the value of 1. So it means that our cell data contains all these parameters and one of them is reward. So I know the specific name of this key and I can access it by writing celldata.reward. So now we pass it inside of our trigger. So let's test how it works. And now you see that our counter have been increased by 1, but if we click our animal, it doesn't work anymore. So here is the problem in this parenthesis. Previously, this function haven't asked any parameters. This was the reason why we could pass it without parentheses. There is one problem. For passing a new parameter, we need to put parentheses. But parentheses execute this function immediately. So how to solve this problem? In JavaScript, we have anonymous functions. The syntax is very simple. I just need to add parentheses and then I need to write this arrow. And now if you try clicking our chick, you will see that our counter increases by the level of this chick. So if I go to pets array and if I change the reward to 10, now you will see that each click gives me 10 currency. So let's undo this change. So about this function, anonymous function has a lot of theory behind it, so why it works in this way and why it has this weird syntax. You will understand it with experience, but currently you just need to understand which problem it solves. So if we need to pass our function as a parameter, and if this function expects any parameters, we must put parentheses to write all the parameters that this function expects. But parentheses call the function immediately, and to prevent this behavior, we write the anonymous function. So this function doesn't have any name and it is used only on one line. Also, after our arrow, I can write curly braces. It will work absolutely the same, but now I can expand them And now inside of the curly braces, I can have multiple lines. So let's call this function twice. So now the reward of our chick is 1, but if I click our chick, you will see that our counter increased by 2 because inside of this trigger, we call our function twice. Currently we don't need it, but you just know that you can put many lines inside of anonymous function. So if you have just one line as we have, you don't even need these curly braces. So we have finished with our animal, but our buy button still doesn't work. So let's implement it. Let's think what we want when we click our buy pet button. We want to generate a new animal on our board. We even have a function spawn new pet. So at first, let's call this function every time when user clicks the buy button. Our button is an HTML element. At first, let's access this element inside of our JavaScript. I found this element inside of our HTML, so let's copy this ID, and now I can pass it inside of our function. If you don't understand my variable name, you can call it buy button element. So then we need to write a new trigger that every time when we click our buy button, we spawn a new animal. Now we have section triggers inside of our render function, but there is one difference. So render function is responsible for our board. It represents our board from the variable that we have in our JavaScript. And then we attach all these triggers to this board. But our buy button is a constant HTML element that is outside of our board. So let's create a new section triggers before the game start for constant elements. And now we can attach our click trigger. So our spawn new pet function doesn't require any parameters, and it means that we can just pass this function without parentheses. So now let's test how it works. If I click our buy button, nothing will change, and this is because inside of our spawn new pet function, we doesn't call the render function that will update the board of our page. So here, let's call the render function. And now, if you save this file, you will see that something weird happens because we have 2 times more elements on our board. And if you click the buy button, you will see more cells on our board. And this is because our render function creates new cells, but it doesn't remove the old cells. So every time before we generate new cells, we need to clear our board. You see that we append all our cells to the board element. So it means that we need to clear this board element before we append new children. For that, in the beginning of this function, I can write board element.innerHTML, which is equal to empty string. Inside of the HTML file, find the div with the ID grid. So this is our board. And what innerHTML means, it means all the content that is inside of our grid. So for example, we have many divs inside of this grid, and then if you call innerHTML, which is equal to empty string, it takes all these divs and removes them. So simply, it removes all the elements, and it means that we start from the new board when we call this function. In JavaScript, we have a variable board and we store all the data inside of this variable. And you need to understand that we actually don't remove the data from this variable. We just remove the previous state of our HTML board. So actually we don't lose any data, we just clear it before generating new board. And now if you click buy button, you will see that it generates a new animal on our board. Currently, our users can click this button as much as they want. So actually, we need to check that our user has enough currency for buying a new animal, and then we need to subtract this cost from the total currency that our user has. So for that, let's change our spawn new pet function. In the beginning, let's add a new section, validation. And the first check that we will do is that our user has enough currency. For that, I can write that our poop is more or equal to 10. If I use the hard-coded value 10, it means that I can change the cost of our pets. So if you want to change this cost every time when user buy a new pet, so to make the progression that each next pet costs more and more, you need to create a new variable where you will store the pet cost, and then you need to create a function that will increase this variable every time when you call it. But for the simplicity, we stay with the constant price. So every time our pet's price will be 10. And this is the reason why I can just use this 10 without making a new variable for that. So, and now if our user has enough poop, we can create a new pet and then we can put it on our board. But actually, here we have one problem. What if we will have several checks? Every time when I add a new if statement, our data goes further and further, and it becomes difficult to read. So, and for preventing it, let's undo our changes. And actually, in the validation, we need to check the negative outcome. So in our case, what if our poop is less than 10? In this case, we need to show some kind of error and then we need to stop our function. So for showing an error, we can use alert function that will generate a new pop-up for our user. For that, I call the function alert, and now inside of this function, I can write a message that I will show to our user. So I will write the message that you don't have enough poop, and then for stopping this function, I can write the keyword return. Now let's test how it works. So at first I will change our poop to 1 and then you will immediately see a pop-up with the message that you don't have enough poop. And this is because in the game start we call our function spawn new pet immediately. So actually it means that our function works correctly because as you see we haven't spawned a new animal. So I return back our poop to 10 and now let's click our button again. So you see that we buy a new pet but our counter remains the same. So we need to subtract the cost from our counter. So before we call the render function, let's decrease our poop by 10. Now you see that we start our game with 1 pet on the map and with 0 currency. And if I click buy new pet, you will see the message that you don't have enough poop and nothing will change. So it means that our function works correctly. Currently you might think that we have implemented the buy button, but actually there are a few mistakes and edge cases that we need to take into account. Let's increase the initial poop counter to 1000. So we can generate animals easily, and the first problem that you will see that if you buy a new animal, our counter remains the same. And this is because inside of our spawn new pet function, we call the render function that updates our board. But we don't call update UI function that updates our UI elements. So let's call it. Now let's click this button again. So currently we decrease the right amount of currency, but there are still other problems. For example, what if our board is full? In this case, if you click our buy button, you will see that our counter decreases, but a new animal haven't been generated. And this is because our board is full. But what we actually want to show, we want to show to our user that the board is full, so you can't create a new animal. So let's create a new validation that will check that our board is full. For that, I will create a new variable board is full and the default value will be true. So I imply that the board is full in the beginning. And then we need to write a for loop that will go through each cell and check if there is at least one empty cell or not. Here I create the same variable as in our render function, and now we can check if the cell data is equal to null. We can set our board is full variable to be false. If at least one cell is null, it means that our board is not full, so we can buy a new animal. Here I also can write the keyword break. So as we reach this keyword, we stop the execution of our loop. Even if you remove this keyword, you will not see any visual changes, but if you think how it works, when you don't have the keyword break, it means that your for loop goes through an entire board. But actually, if the first cell is null, we set our board is full variable to false, and then there are no sense for continuing this loop. So just for better efficiency, we can add this keyword. And now, after our for loop, we can check that if our board is full, we need to show an error and then we need to stop the function. I can use the same alert function as in our first validation, but I will just change the content of this message. So for example, I can write that board is full and then I write the return keyword to finish this function. Now let's test how it works. Currently, I have a full board, and if I try to buy a new animal, you see a message that board is full. And then you see that our counter remains the same. But there is still one problem that you might notice. If we have many pets and if we want to buy a new one, we need to press the buy button many times. And this is because we have the index overlap. So currently we generate a random index between 0 until the board length. So for example, instead of calling this function, let's put 0. So now all the time our chick is generated on the first cell. And then no matter how much I click this button, there will not be new animals. If two animals have the same index, a new one just overwrites the previous one. Actually, when we call our generate pet index, we want to check that this index is unique. The easiest way to check it is to write a while loop that will check that if the cell with a newly generated index contains a pet, it means that we need to generate a new index. But before writing a while loop, be sure that you wrote the second validation about board is full. Every time when you write a while loop, you need to think, can there be an infinite loop or not? So currently we want to check that our index is unique. But what happens if our board is full? If our board is full, it means that we don't have any free cells. There are no new index that we can generate. So currently we wrote the validation about the board is full, and it means that we safely can write a while loop. So after we created our index, let's check that if our board with the current index is not equal to null, it means that it contains an animal. We will generate a new index. And now we need to change the keyword const to the keyword let, because we want to reassign the same variable. And now let's test how it works. So currently on my map, I have only one cell, and if I click buy new animal, we should spawn a new animal exactly on this cell. We see a new animal, and we also see that our counter have been updated, so it means that we have implemented our buy button. Eventually, our spawn new pet function became much more complex than we expected, but this is very common in programming. All the time you need to think about edge cases. What if user behaves not as you expect? So now let's add the merging buttons. If you have two animals of the same level, you can merge them, and then you will get a new animal of the next level. At first, let's go to our index.html file, and here let's create this button manually so we can see what we need to generate with our JavaScript. Inside of the div with the ID grid, let's create a new div with the class cell. And now you will see that we can generate new cells manually. And this is because in our JavaScript, inside of the render function, we have this line that clears an entire board before generating new cells. So let's go to our game start and let's comment out these functions for a while. Now you can see only HTML elements that we have created manually. So let's return to our index.html file, and here let's manually create our board. So I added 16 cells, and now inside of the first cell, let's add a new animal. So for that, I created a new div with the class pet and with the text content of our chick emoji. And now let's create a new button inside of this div. So at first I expand this div, and now let's add a new button. Now you can see a very small button right under our chick. Let's write a word merge. And now you can see that we have a normal button right after our chick. In the style.css, you can see this block, and this block adds all the styles to the button that is inside of the element with the class cell. So now you can click this button, but nothing will happen because we don't attach any triggers to this button. Let's also add a class drag over for this button. And now you see that our button is highlighted. And this is because in our CSS, we have the style drag over that adds this stroke right after our element. And then this green light that you see is just a box shadow. So what we want to create with our JavaScript, we want to have this default buttons. And then when user clicks this button, we want to attach this class drag over, so the user can visually see that this animal is selected. Currently, I don't delete this manually created HTML board, we'll delete it later. So let's use it as a reference so we understand what we need to generate with our JavaScript. So now let's go to our JavaScript file and let's comment out our GameStar functions. And now you see that we have chick without our button merge. So we generate our board inside of the render function. Now, if our JavaScript board contains the data about our animal, we need to create all these elements. So the first element is a div with the class cell. So you can see that we create this div in our JavaScript and then we attach the class cell to this div. The next we need to create div with the class pet, and now you see that if our cell data is not null, so it means that our cell data contains the information about our pet, we create a new div pet div and then we attach the class pet and the text content of our emoji. And now we need to create a new HTML element button. So right after our pets and before our trigger section, I create a new section merging. And here let's create a new HTML button. Now we created our merge button element. The next step is to add our text content. So we will add a constant word merge and we will not change it later. Now let's attach the class drag over. As I said, we need to attach this class only when we click this button. For that, inside of the trigger section, I can add a new trigger. In the previous video, we used anonymous function for our trigger. So this is a function without any name and this is used only on one line. One of the advantages of this function is that we can pass it as a variable. So now let's create a new anonymous function, but I also add curly braces and then I expand them. And now we will not call a new function, let's just write all the changes that we want directly inside of this anonymous function. So we want to attach our class drag over. Now we have created our button, but it still doesn't know where it is located. So as you see, our button is a child of the pet div. So now, before we append our pet div to the cell div, let's append our button to the pet div. And now you can see that we have created an animal with the button merge. And if I click this button, now you see that this animal is active. But even if we have many animals, we still can't merge them. So we can just activate these buttons, but we also need to write a logic for merging our animals. Our render function becomes longer and longer, so I don't want to write all the logic inside of this trigger. Let's write a new function try to merge that will be responsible for the merging logic. So I call try to merge function and then I pass the index of the current tile. And now let's create this function. Inside of the section core actions, let's create a new function. This function wants to receive the index about the current cell that have been clicked. So here, let's write a new parameter cell index. And now we know that this index is a number from the 0 until the board.length. But we also need the index of the previously clicked animal because we want to merge two animals together. So for that, we can create two global variables. So the merge cell index 1 and the merge cell index 2. In the beginning of our code, we have the game data. So let's add both these variables. So I added two variables, merge cell index 1 and merge cell index 2, and I put the default value to be equal to null. Now we know that this variable can be equal to null or an index. So inside of the try to merge function, let's try to think about all the possible cases. So the first case, when both these indexes are equal to null. If they both are equal to null, we want to set our current cell index to the variable merge cell index 1. Then we will have all other cases, but we want to finish this function, so let's write the keyword return to finish this function. So now, when I click the merge button, you see that this button is selected, but if I buy a new animal, our board is recreated from scratch and currently our render function doesn't know which animal have been selected. Currently, we attach our class name only if we click on an animal. Actually, we need to check that if our merge cell index is equal to our current index, it means that this animal have been selected previously, and even when we recreate our board, we want to attach our drag over class. So after the merging, let's add this if statement. If our merge cell index 1 is equal to I, or if our merge cell index 2 is equal to I, it means that the current animal is active and we need to attach our class. Now let's test how it works. I click the merge button and then I buy a new animal. And now you see that we have created a new board, but we preserved the state of the previously clicked animal. So now if I have many animals, I can still select many animals. But if I buy a new animal, you will see that only the first animal preserves the selected state. And this is because in our try to merge function, we save the index only of the first selected animal. Let's think about other cases. The second case is when our merge cell index 1 is not equal to null. So it means that it has any index, but our merge cell index 2 still is equal to null. We want to attach our cell index to the merge cell index 2. And now it means that two animals are selected. In our logic, when we select two animals, there are two possible cases. There can be an error, so for example, their levels are different, or we merge them together. So at first, let's write the merging logic, and then we will work on the validation. Let's create a new animal of the next level. So I have a constant pets that contains all the data about all the possible animals. And here you see that they are sorted in the incremented order. So it means that the first pet we can access with the index 0, the second pet we can access with the index 1 and it has the level 2. We can access the last pet with the index 9 and it has the level 10. So here we have a formula where we can access the next pet using the level of the current pet. So I wrote this formula here that the next pet index is equal to the level of our current pet. But inside of the try to merge function, I don't have access to our current animals. So let's access them. So I know that inside of this if statement, both our variables have index. And it means that I can use this index to access our pet elements inside of the board. And now to get the next level pet, I can write the pet1.level. There is no difference which pet we will use, the pet1 or the pet2, because we imply that for the merging, they must have the same level. So for example, the next level pet can be equal to bunny and it has all the same parameters like emoji name, level and reward. So now when we want to merge two animals, we want to remove the first selected animal from the board and then we want to update the second selected animal to be a new animal of the next level. So let's remove the previously selected animal. So I know that the index of this animal is stored in the merge cell index variable and I know that in our board we have the permanent data about all our cells. So now we can access our board by the index of the first selected animal and we can set it to null. And now in the same way, let's access the second animal and let's set it to a next level pet. Now let's test how it works. So I select the first animal and now if I click the second animal, you will see that both these animals are selected, but nothing happens. Actually, they have been replaced, but we didn't call the render function yet, so we don't see these changes on our board. For example, our buy button call our render function. So let's buy a new animal. And now you see that we have created an animal of the next level. So at first, let's call the render function. And also you can see that our newly created animal preserves the state of being active. So before the render function, let's reset our merge cell indexes. Now let's test this function again. I can select the first animal, and then if I select the second animal, you see that we create a new animal of the next level and this animal is not selected. So now let's work on the validation. So for example, if I have two animals of different level, I can't merge them. Let's check that the levels of animals are the same. I call this section validation and now let's create a new if statement. So if their levels are not equal, we want to show this error to our user. For that, we can use alert function. Here, I need to write a message. So let's write that the levels are different. And then I want to stop this function. And for that, I can write the return keyword. Let's test how it works. I select the first animal. And then if I select the second pet, you see the message that the levels are different. But then you see that both animals preserve the selected state, so we need to reset it. Actually, I can copy an entire reset block and then I can add it to our validation. Now let's make the same situation. So you see the message that levels are different, and then you see that the selected state have been removed. Our function works correctly, but there are still several edge cases. We check only that the levels of our animals are the same. We don't check that the indexes are different. So it means that I can merge the animal to itself. So we want to prevent this logic, and for that let's add a new validation. If merge cell indexes are the same, let's write the message that you can't merge a pet to itself. And after that, let's add our reset block. Now let's test it. So if I click the merge button 2 times, I see the message that you can't merge a pet to itself. And then I see that the selected state is gone. Currently, the last level of our animals is 10, and this is a unicorn. And the problem is that we can't merge the animals of the last level because we don't have the animal of the next level. So let's also check that if there is no animal of the next level, you can't merge these animals. We have a formula for the next pet index. This is equal to our pet.level, and then we pass this index to the pets array, and this pets array returns an object. Actually, if there is no animal, it will return undefined. Let's check that if the next level pet is equal to undefined, it means that we are trying to merge the animals of the maximum level. And then I add a reset block. So now it means that the next level pet will always be an object. So let's remove this comment. And now let's test how it works. Currently I have 2 animals of the maximum level, and if I try to merge them, you will see the message that you can't merge animals of the maximum level. Now you see that in all these validations, we are using the same reset block. So to prevent repetitions, let's create a new helper function, reset indexes. In the helper section, let's write a new function. So we don't pass any parameters to this function because we will reset the global variables. Inside of this function, I reset our indices, but all the time when we do a change with our board, we call the render function. So here, let's call our render function also. And now I can call this function instead of our reset block. In all places where I have this comment reset, I replace this block with reset indexes, but only one word that we can't remove is return, because it stops the current function. And also, we are using the same block in the end of our function. There's also one counter that we need to increase for our UI. So when we merge our animals, we want to increase the counter of the best level animal. In our global variables, you see that we have a variable best level. Every time when we create a new animal, let's increase this counter. And now let's test how it works. So I have 2 animals, and then I want to merge them. And now you see that we have the animal of the second level, so the best level counter is set to 2. So the best level counter shows 2. But actually, we can merge many animals of the same level. But here we have the problem that if I try to merge the same animals of the first level, we will increase our counter even though that we don't have a new animal of the third level. Instead of just increasing our counter, we need to check, does the level of the next level pet is higher than the current best level? So the easiest way how to check it is by using the math.max function. So we can pass many values inside of this function, and then it will return only one number that is the highest. So in our case, we will pass 2 parameters. The first one will be the current best level, and the next parameter will be the level of the next pet. So let's test how it works. Now, if I create a new animal of the next level, you see that our counter have been increased. But then if I create this animal again, you see that our counter remains the same. So now let's create a new animal of the third level. and again our counter have been increased. So it means that our function works correctly. Now we have a fully working game where you can merge different animals and you can create a new animal of the next level. But every time when you refresh the page, you lose all the progress that you have. But for saving our games, we need to learn a new theory about JSON files. So at first, let's discuss how our project works in the browser. We have three main files: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Our HTML and CSS are static, but our JavaScript adds the functionality to communicate with our game. Eventually, I can click buttons and our animals, and then on the page, you see how our currency counter changes. On the page, you see only HTML and CSS. Even though that now you see another counter, our initial HTML file stays the same. And eventually, when I refresh this page, you see a new state of this game that was created from our initial files. Our files are connected to the browser, and our browser can ask these files again. Actually, we might have many users. So each user is a separate session that shares the same initial files. And then this user can communicate with our game to change the state of this game. So if we want to save this state, we can't save it inside of our initial files because it will influence other players of our game. So for example, I have this initial game, and when I buy a new animal, you see that the state of this game have been changed. And if then I save this state inside of our initial files, other users will see the same change on their pages. And this is the reason why we can't save our changes directly inside of our initial files. If we can't save it inside of these files, let's think what is another place where we can save these changes. I added icons of other browsers to give you a clue. Actually, each user has its own browser. Even though that I showed three different browsers can be of the same instance. For example, all our users can use only Chrome browser. But the most important here is that each user downloads a browser directly to their device. So it means that all users have instances of their own browsers. And I can easily prove it because now I am in the Chrome browser and I can create a new tab, but you will not see this tab on your browser. So it means that I have the instance of my own browser that is saved on my computer. Actually, each browser has its own storage where we can save some data or files. Now we need to figure out what we need to save. At first you might think that we must save the copies of our initial HTML, CSS and JavaScript files. But actually it will not work because imagine if I want to create a new update for my initial files. Then it means that this user that stores the copies of my old application will always use the old application. Let's think what we change when we interact with our game. So all changes happens because of our script.js file. So actually when users interact with our page, they change only the game data, and then our JavaScript file recreates the HTML based on this game data. So it means that it would be enough for us to save only this data inside of the browser. So it means that I can store only my variables, but actually I can't store my variables directly. I need some kind of format for storing our data, and this format is called JSON. So at first let's create a JSON file. For that I create a new file with the name storage and with the type JSON. Initially this file is empty, and now let's add some data that we want to store. So for example, let's store the counter of our currency. Let's call this variable poop, but if I write it, I will see the error that expected a JSON object. The JSON stands for JavaScript object notation. So it means that it uses the same syntax as objects in JavaScript. So this is an object in JavaScript, so we need to use the same syntax. So we need to start from the curly braces. So and then we know that JavaScript objects contain key value pairs. So let's write a pair poop that is equal to 10. If I just write poop, I will have the error that property keys must be double quoted. So this is the first difference between objects in JavaScript and JSON. In JSON, I always must put quotes for keys, and then I can write column 10. In the same way as in JavaScript, we are using column instead of the equal sign for showing that 10 is the value of the key poop. So and this is the easiest JSON file where we stored only one key value pair. So let's add another property, for example, best level. If I start typing a new key, you will see the error that expected comma. So it means that all my key value pairs must be separated with comma. So the value of the best level is 1. Also, if I try to put the trailing comma, you will see the error. Also, we can store other data types like arrays and objects. For example, I wrote board, which is equal to array of nulls. In our game, we have 16 cells, but here I wrote only 2. And then, for example, let's store a pet, which is equal to a new object. Now I can expand this object, and here I can write new key value pairs. So for example, I can write name level and reward. There are also some data that we can store. For example, we can store undefined. Inside of the board, if I try to write undefined instead of the null, you will see an error. So JSON can store only nulls, but can't store undefined. Also, we can store or call any functions. And this is because JSON is not like a JavaScript. This is similar to text files. So for example, I can open a notepad and here I can write console.log. So, and nothing will happen, and this is because all lines that we write inside of the txt file are just strings. So this is the same as writing console.log in JavaScript with quotes. The main difference between JSON and text files is that JSON has a specific structure, so this is easy to extract the data from the JSON. So now you know the basic syntax of JSON, so let's look how to work with it in the browser. At first, I have a simple web page with index.html, with style.css, and with empty script.js files. And then I connect to the browser by using the live server extension. So now here I see our web page that contains nothing, and let's open the console. So now let's write the first console log to see that our JavaScript is connected to the browser. So I see the response in the console, so it means that our application is connected. We connect all our files to our HTML file. And here, as you see, only our style.css and script.js files are connected. So we don't connect our JSON file. And this is because we don't have any initial JSON that we share with all the users, and we store JSON directly inside of each browser. So let's find the place where our JSON is located. For that, in the browser, you need to find this double arrow icon, and then you need to find the application option. So I opened my application, and here on the left side, you can see the storage. So we need to find the local storage. Now we can expand it, and then we will find a local storage for our local host. So this is the place where we will store our variables. As you see, we have a small table with key and value. So this is the representation of our JSON. So now inside of the JavaScript, let's write our first variable that we will store. So let's store our currency, but currently this currency is just a variable in JavaScript. At first we need to create a JSON string. For that, let's create a new variable poop.json, and then we have the built-in JSON object, and if you write dot, you will see two methods that this object has. So we will use the stringify method, and here I can pass the value that I want to stringify. So let's write the name of our variable poop. And also let's log to the console both these variables to see the difference. I return back to my console, and here I see two variables. So our poop is equal to a number 10, and our poop.json is equal to string of the 10. So simply it means that json.stringify converts all the data types into the strings. So no matter how complex our structure is, it will anyway convert our variable. Until your variable doesn't contain undefined or functions, the json.stringify will be able to convert it. And now let's save it in our local storage. So for that, we have an object LocalStorage. And this object has several methods, so you need to find the set item. Now this method expects two parameters, key and value. If you look to our JSON, you will find that this is the key of our variable poop, and this is the value of the same variable. So let's pass them. And now let's open our application tab, and here you can see that in the table we have our first variable poop, which is equal to 10. Actually, we created this simple JSON file. So and now let's do the opposite steps to get our variable from the local storage. So at first I need to write local storage, and then I need to find the getItem method. This method expects only one parameter, which is the key. So let's write poop. this line will return the poop JSON. So let's store it inside of this variable. And now let's convert it back to our initial variable. For that, I will use the json.parse function. And now let's log to the console this variable. So in the console, you can see that we have the 10, and the type of this 10 is a number. So it means that we successfully load the data from our storage. Now let's also wrap this code into the save and load functions. I also found that inside of the save function, we use the hard-coded value 10, but actually I want to provide the poop JSON variable. And let's also write the load function. Now I wrapped our code inside of the functions. So let's also change these functions a little bit. So let's create a global variable poop. And then let's create the global variable poop.json, which is equal to null. And now inside of our functions, we just reassign our values. Inside of our local storage, we have the pair poop, which is equal to 10. And no matter how much I refresh this page, this value will be here until the user manually deletes it. But if you want to manually delete some pairs from the local storage, you can click on your pair and then you can press delete button, or you have a button clear all. So now you see that we have no values, and at first let's save our initial value. So for that, I call the save function. Now let's imagine that our user earns the currency. So a new value of our currency is 100. So let's store a new value of our currency. So as you see, in the local storage we have poop, which is equal to 100. And now let's imagine that our user refreshes the page. So we return back to the initial value, which is 10. But at this point, we can call the load function. And as you see in the console, no matter that the initial value of the poop is equal to 10, we loaded the previous state of our game. And in the same way, you can store complex data like arrays and objects. We learned about JSON and how to store our data in the browser. Now let's use this knowledge for implementing save, load and reset buttons. So at first, in our HTML, where you see the div with the ID grid, let's remove all these manually created divs. You will not see any changes on this board, just we created them to better understand which divs we need to generate with JavaScript. And now let's go to our script.js file. As I said before, if we want to store the state of our game, we need to store the game data. Actually, we will store only these variables because our array pets is a constant, so user can't change it. So let's go through each section and let's think how to write the function for saving our data. I don't think that we need to add something to the game data. So let's go to the next section. Then I see HTML elements section. So here we access our HTML elements. Let's access our save button. Now I need to pass the ID of the save button HTML element. In the index.html file, I can find the button element with the ID save button. So let's copy this ID and now let's pass it into our function. So the next section is helpers. Currently I don't think that we will write any helpers. So let's go to the next section, core actions. And here in the end of this section, so before the rendering section, let's add a new function save. So this function will save all our game data in the local storage of our browser. In the local storage, we store JSON files which are converted into the strings. The JSON has the same format as JavaScript objects, so let's convert all our game data into the object. I create an empty object data, and now I need to write all these variables inside of this object. I put quotes before each key, even though that this is not mandatory in JavaScript. I put it so we can understand that this is the name of our key and this is the variable, so the data that we store inside of this key. So actually this is what we will store. So this is an array with a lot of nulls, or sometimes we have objects of our pets. So after we converted it into the object, let's convert it into the JSON string. For that, I create a new variable data.json, and now I can use the json.stringify method where I need to pass our data. So this function just converts our object into the string so we can store it inside of our local storage, and then we can easily convert it back with the json.parse function. So now let's store it inside of the local storage. Here we see several methods and we will use setItem. So this function expects two parameters. The first is the key, how our saving will be called. And the second is the value, so what we actually save. So the key is just a string. So let's write something like merge pet key. Actually, I know that we will use the same key in the load function. So instead of copying and pasting it all the time, let's extract it into a separate constant. So inside of our game data, let's add a new constant saving key. So I write it with capital letters because the keyword const in JavaScript doesn't always mean that this is a constant variable. So for example, here we declared our board with the const keyword, but actually this const just prevents the container, which is array, to be changed, but the user can change the data inside of this container. So this is the reason why this is not a constant, but here we want to prevent any mutation of the saving key. So only the developer can change the string. And I extract it because when we change our string, all the remaining functions should work. So instead of passing the hard-coded string, we pass the variable. So instead of the merge pet key, let's use our variable. So now we need to write the second parameter, which is the data that we want to store. So this is very important to write data JSON. If you pass the variable data instead of the data JSON, you will store the result object. This is a useless result. Just you need to know that when you see it in the local storage, it means that you saved the object, not a string. So now this function save our data inside of the local storage. And now let's show a message to our user that the game is saved. So we finished our save function, and now let's go to the next section. In the rendering section, we update our UI and board. So actually when we store our game, we don't want to update any UI elements. So it means that we can skip this section. And then we have the trigger section. So here we can write our trigger. So when the user clicks the button save, we will execute the save function. And now we can test how it works. So currently I have 1000 currency, and let's click the save button. Now you see the message that game is saved. So I can click OK, and now let's open our local storage and see what we have saved. For that, you need to inspect the page. And then on the right top side, you will find two arrows icon. So here you need to choose the application option. So now inside of the storage section, you can find the local storage. You need to expand it. And then you will find the local storage for the local host that we have. So here you can find the key, merge pet key, and the value. So this is our JSON string that we saved. If I click it, you can see what the string contains. Here you see the best level, currency counter. Also you see our board. If we expand our board, you can find that on one cell, in this case, on the cell with ID 13, we have our pet data. Now, if I refresh the page, you see that our counter have been decreased. But if we check our local storage again, you will see that here we store 1000 currency. So it means that currently we can write the function for loading this data, and then we will be able to restore our state. So for the load function, let's go through all the sections again. In the game data, we will not write anything. Then we have the HTML elements. So here, let's access our load button. Now let's find this ID in the HTML. Here I can find the button with ID load button. Let's copy and paste it inside of our function. Then in the helper section, we will not add anything. Let's go to our core action section. Here, right after our save function, let's write a new function load. Now we need to do the same steps in the reverse order. So at first, let's access the data from the local storage. For that, I will use the method getItem. So this method expects one parameter, which is the key. So let's pass the saving key. And now this line will return our data JSON. So let's store it in the variable. And now we need to get our data from the data JSON. For that, we will use the json.parse function. Now we extracted the same data as in our save function. And now we need to use it to rewrite the global variables. So these variables we will rewrite, but we have one problem with the variable board. I can't rewrite it because we are using the const keyword. The proper way is when you remain the const keyword and then you write a for loop for replacing all the data inside of the board. But we will use the easiest way. So let's change the const keyword to the let keyword. And now it means that we can reassign our board. So inside of the load function, let's reassign all our global variables. And after we updated our global variables, we actually want to see these changes on our page. So it means that we need to call the update UI and the render functions. And after that, let's add a new alert message that the game is loaded. So now let's go to the trigger section, and here let's add a new trigger to our load button. So now let's test how it works. In the local storage, you have the previous saving with 1000 currency. So let's click the load button. Now I see the message that the game is loaded, and if I click OK, you see that we restored our game state. But actually, the load function is a little bit more tricky, because what if user clicks load button before it made any changes? So let's go to our local storage, and here let's delete this saving. And now let's try to load our game state. If I click this button, you don't see any changes on our page, but also you don't see the message that the game is loaded. So it means that we have some kind of error. Let's open our console, and here you can see that we have the type error because we can't read the property board of the null. So actually what happens? The data JSON is trying to access the item with the saving key, but we don't have this item in the local storage. So it means that the value of this line will be null or undefined. Then we are trying to parse the null value. In this case, we will anyway get the null or undefined. So JSON.parse can parse other data types, not only strings, but in this case, it will return the initial state. And then we have the line where we reassign our board to data.board. So this is the same as writing null.board, but null doesn't contain any board. So this is the reason why we have this error. So let's write a new validation that if our data is equal to null or undefined, it means that we don't have any savings yet. So it means that we shouldn't execute our load function. And now let's test how it works. I don't have any savings in the local storage. Let's click the load button, and now you see the message that no savings yet, and then nothing changes. Now I can say that our function works correctly. So now let's write the last function for the reset. Let's go through all the sections again. So in the game data, we don't need to change anything. Then we have the HTML elements. Let's access our reset button. In the index.html, I can find this ID reset button. So let's copy and paste it. So then I have the helper section. I don't need to add any functions there. Let's go inside of our core action section. And here, right after our load function, let's add a new function reset. So actually, this function does the same as when we refresh our page, but also I want to delete our saving when we click the reset button, because currently we don't have any way for deleting our saving. So the proper way would be to reassign all these variables to the initial value. But actually, there is one trick that we can use. So there is a function location.reload, and if you read the description of this function, you will see that this function like refresh button. So this is kind of tricky way how we can reset our game without reassigning our variables. And then after that, let's also delete our local storage saving. So inside of the local storage object, I have two methods that we can use. So the first method is clear. So this method clears all the keys that we store in the local storage. So currently we use only one key, and this perfectly suits for our case. But there is one problem. If in the future you will add more keys, you can forget that in the reset button, you use clear function that removes all of them. So and this is the reason why I prefer another function. Local storage object also has the function remove item. So in here we need to pass our key, and then this function will remove this key value pair from our local storage. So let's pass our saving key here. And now we know that reset function will delete only our key. So it means that if in the future I will add more keys, I will not have unexpected behavior. Also, we can write the message that the game is reset. then I don't even need to add update UI or render functions, and this is because we have the section GameStart where we call all these functions. So when we use location.reload, we refresh the page, and it means that we recreate all this code from the beginning. So we call the GameStart functions also. So I think that the reset function is finished. Now let's add a new trigger to the reset button. And now let's test how it works. So at first, let's save our game state. I see the message that the game is saved. Now let's buy many animals. Now let's load our game state. I see the message that game is loaded, and now I see that we have our game state. Now let's reset our game. I see the message that game is reset, and now let's try to load our game again, and I see the message that no savings yet. So it means that all these functions work correctly. There's one problem with save and load functions that you need to be aware of. Currently, we recreate our data object based on all the global variables that we have. But what happens when we add a new global variable? So for example, I add a new global variable clicks. Now, to save my clicks, I need to change the save and load functions. So inside of the save function, I need to manually add a new global variable. And then I also need to go to the load function, and here I need to add a new variable to reassign. So actually, when we add new variables, we don't want to rewrite our functions. So, and we have this problem because initially we chose the wrong way of saving our data. So let's remove these changes. And here in the save function, you see, we recreate this data object. So actually, from the beginning, we can save all the data inside of this object. So it means that in the game data section, instead of saving all our data into separate variables, we can create one variable data. And now we can store all our data inside of this variable. So for example, I store our board and poop. Actually, we can store all the data here, and then we can use only this variable data inside of all other functions. So for example, we have the function increase poop inside of the helper section. And here, instead of increasing the poop directly, we increase the poop inside of the data object. So currently I undo these changes, and this is because we have a long project with more than 200 JavaScript lines. So it means that if we recreate our global variables inside of the one object, we will need to refactor very a lot of lines. I don't want to spend your time on this. I consciously used the way of storing all the data in separate variables because this is a natural way how you store your variables. But currently, this is important that you know the problem that many functions needs to access these global variables, and it means that if you add a new variable, you will need to rewrite your functions. For preventing this logical error, in your future projects, store all your global data inside of the object. So now let's implement the Autoclicker. At first, let's think what Autoclicker should do. In the description of this feature, I wrote that Autoclicker earns poopy currency every second based on your best pet level. Under our currency counter, we have the counter for the best pet level on the board. So currently, the best level that I have is the first one. So it means that Autoclicker should click any of the first level pet each second. For example, if I merge these animals, now you see that I have an animal of the second level, so it means that our Autoclicker should click this animal every second. In our code, let's go through each section and let's think what we need to add. The first section is the game data. We already stored the best level, so let's return to this section later. The next section is HTML elements, and here we can access our Autoclicker button. So let's go to the HTML to find the ID of this button. In the index.html, I see that we have a button with the label enabled for 16 poopy currency. So this is the button that we have on our page, and the ID of this button is auto button. So let's copy this ID, and now let's paste it inside of the getElementById method. So now let's go to the next section. In the helper section, I see the increase poop function, and we even can pass the reward directly to this function. So we can use this function for our Autoclicker. And now let's go directly to the trigger section, and here let's add a new trigger. So for example here, I can add the event listener that will call our increase poop function on the click. Now let's test how it works. If I click the enable button, you will see that nothing happens, and this is because increasePoop function expects one parameter. So for passing this parameter, we put the parenthesis, but parenthesis executes this function immediately. So actually it means that we need to use the anonymous function to pass our increasePoop as a variable. So now let's test it again. I can click the Autoclicker, and now you see that our currency counter increases by 1. But actually we want to enable this Autoclicker, and then we want to set interval that will click our pets automatically each second. So at first, let's expand our anonymous function. So for that, I need to add curly braces, and then I can expand them. And now I can write multiple lines inside of this anonymous function. So at first, inside of the increasePoop function, we pass the hard-coded value 1, but actually we want to pass the reward of the best level animal. If you go to the game data section, you'll find that we store the best level, but actually the best level is not always equal to the reward. As you see in our constant pets, we have two different columns, one for the level and one for the reward, and they are not always equal to each other. So let's write a small helper function that will find the reward based on the best level. So inside of the helper section, right after the reset indexes, let's write a new function. So I call this function getBestReward, and now we need to get this reward from the pets constant. So at first we need to find the index of the animal that we want to access. If you look to the pets constant, you will find that our levels are from 1 to 10, so they are 1 based. But actually we store them inside of the array, which is a 0 based. So it means that the pet index is equal to the level of this pet minus 1. And now we can find the animal by using this index. So this code will give us a pet object, so let's store it inside of the pet variable. And now you see that inside of this object, we have the reward. So let's access it. And now we can return the reward. Let's use this function instead of the hard-coded value 1. So inside of the trigger section, I call the getBestReward function. Now let's test how it works. The best level on the map is 1, and if I click the Autoclicker, you see that my counter increases by 1. Now I have the animal of the second level, so this animal has the reward 2, and if I click our Autoclicker, you see that our counter increases by 2. So it means that our function works correctly, but we still don't have our Autoclicker. Currently we need to click this button manually. Let's add the interval that will increase poop each second. For that, I have the function setInterval. This function expects two parameters. So the first parameter is the function that we want to call. So in our case, we want to call increasePoop function. So let's put it inside of the setInterval. And the second parameter is the amount of seconds, how often we should call this function. So we want to call it after each second. But this function expects milliseconds, so I can write 1000 milliseconds. And now let's test how it works. If I click the enable button, you will see that we again increased our counter by 1, but then our Autoclicker doesn't work. And this is because we wrote increasePoop function with parentheses. So again, this function executes immediately, but actually we need to pass this function as a variable. So for that, let's wrap it inside of the anonymous function. And now let's test how it works. If I click the Autoclicker, now you see that our currency counter increases by 1 each second. Let's buy a new animal and let's merge them. Now I have the animal of the second level, and you see that our counter increases by 2. So it means that our function works correctly. Actually, we have one severe problem. We can click our enable button several times. And now you will see that our counter increases much faster because each time when you click this button, you add a new interval. So we want to prevent this behavior, and for that, let's check that if we already have our set interval, it means that we need to do nothing. For validating do we have the set interval or not, we need to add a new global variable. Let's add a new variable autoclick enabled. This will be a boolean, and initially it will be equal to false. So it means that our autoclicker is not enabled. Now let's return back to our trigger, and here let's check that if our autoclicker is enabled, it means that we need to do nothing. So we can finish this function. For that we can write if autoclicker enabled, and only if this value is equal to true, we will go to the body of this if statement and we will call the return keyword. So return keyword will finish our function. But now we need to enable our autoclicker. At this point, I know that our autoclicker enabled is equal to false. So let's set it to true. Now we can test how it works. I click the Autoclicker button and now you see that Autoclicker is enabled. And if I click several times, nothing happens. We still see that our counter increases with the same speed. Actually, our Autoclicker has a cost, which is 60 rupee currency. Let's also validate that our player has enough currency. So before we enable our Autoclicker, let's add a small validation. So I check that if the currency counter is less than 60, it means that our user doesn't have enough resources. So I show the message that you don't have enough poop and then I finish this function. But if our user has enough currency, let's update our counter. Also, let's update the label so our user will see that the Autoclicker is enabled. So I changed the text content of the Autoclicker button and now let's test how it works. If I click the Autoclicker, you see that our button changes the label to the enabled and now you see that our Autoclicker works. I can't buy more than one Autoclicker, but we also need to think about our save, load and reset buttons. So currently, when I save our game, I don't save the state of our Autoclicker. So let's test how it works. At first, I save our game. And then I load the game. In this case, our Autoclicker is still enabled, but if we refresh the page and then load our game, you will see that our Autoclicker doesn't work anymore. Let's save our Autoclicker enabled variable. Inside of the save function, I will add a new key value pair. And now let's go to our load function, and here let's also update our global variable. Now let's test how it works. At first, I buy our Autoclicker. Now let's save this game. Then I refresh the page. And now I load our game again. And as you see, nothing happens. And this is because when we refresh the page, all the intervals that we had on our page disappear. So this is just how the refresh button works. So it means that we can just store our variable. We also need to start a new interval. For that, let's copy these 3 lines. And now inside of the load function, after we updated our global variables, let's start the Autoclicker. Now let's test how it works. I buy a new Autoclicker, then I refresh the page, and then I load the Autoclicker again. And now you see that our Autoclicker is enabled and we again earn our currency. But now we still have several problems. Currently, I start a new game. Now let's save a game without the Autoclicker. And then let's load our game. You'll see that our Autoclicker enabled, and this is because in the load function, I don't check the Autoclicker enabled variable. So let's wrap these 3 lines inside of the if statement. Now it means that I will set a new interval only if the Autoclicker enabled is equal to true. Also, I can remove this line because we already have checked that this variable is equal to true. But we still have one severe bug. Let's start the Autoclicker. Then let's save it and now let's load our game several times. Now you see that our counter increases much faster than once per second, and this is because every time when we call the set interval function, we create a new interval on top of the previous one. So all the time when you create a new interval, you must think where you clear this interval. Currently, the only one way how we remove our intervals is the refresh button, but I want to show you a proper way how you need to finish your intervals. For that, you have a function clear interval which expects one parameter. This is ID and the type of this ID is number or undefined. So this is the ID of the previous interval that we want to stop. When we call our interval, we actually can store the value of this interval inside of the variable ID. And then we can pass this variable inside of the function clear interval. And this is because every time when we create a new interval, this function returns a unique ID that we can use for the clear interval. So actually, we don't want to call our clear interval right after the set interval, because it means that we start our interval and then we finish it in the same function. So for implementing this logic, let's create a new global variable autoInterval ID, and then let's write two functions, start autoclicker interval and stop autoclicker interval. Instead of declaring the autoInterval ID inside of the trigger, let's declare it inside of the game data section. So the initial value of the autoInterval ID is null, and let's also change the const keyword to the let. So now we can reassign this variable. So let's copy it and paste inside of our trigger. Now I reassign our autoInterval ID after I call our interval. Then let's remove our clear interval function. And now let's write the function start autoclicker interval. So inside of the helper section, after the getBestReward function, let's write this function. We will not pass anything inside of this function because we store the data about the intervals inside of the global variables. Now let's copy this line from the triggers and let's paste it inside of the start auto interval. We will also use this function when we load our game. Here we also can write a small validation that if our auto interval ID is not equal to null, we need to return our function. Now I'm sure that autoInterval ID creates a new interval only if this variable is equal to null. And then let's write a new function, stop autoInterval. And here let's clear our interval using the autoInterval ID. Also we have the second global variable, which is autoclicker is enabled. So inside of the start autoclicker, let's set this variable to true. And inside of the stop auto interval, let's set it to false. Also, when we start a new interval, we want to change the label of the enable button. So let's add it inside of the start auto interval. And now let's go to our trigger section. So here, instead of these 3 lines, we can use the start auto interval function. And now let's go to the load function. So here, at first we need to stop the previous interval. I call the stop auto interval function, and I don't even need to add any validation, because if the set interval ID is equal to null, our stop auto interval will do nothing. And then inside of the if statement, let's call the start auto clicker function. And now let's test how it works. I enable a new autoclicker, then I save this game, and then I load this game again. Now you see that our autoclicker doesn't work, and this is because in the stop auto interval, we reassign our autoclicker enable to false. And then I check that if this is equal to true, I start a new auto interval. So actually, inside of the stop auto interval, I shouldn't change the autoclicker enabled. Instead of it, I can reassign auto interval ID to null. So now, if you test how it works, you will see that everything works as expected. My congratulations, you have finished this game. There is still a lot of space for the improvements, so if you want, you can improve this game your own. But we will learn a new theory, and after that, we will work on a new project. So in the next video, we will learn about errors in JavaScript.